Yo, 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 what's going on? Welcome back to the Bring the Sink podcast. I'm your host, Justin Hamroun, and today we got a special episode for you guys. Since there is no games this weekend, or a game for that matter, what we're going to do is something different. We're going to go over, starting from 2010 all the way to 2026, our current year, we're going to go over all the possible Super Bowl matchups that we missed out on that could have been great games and even better games than the actual Super Bowl that happened. Now, I'm starting from the conference championship games. I'm not going all the way back from the wild card games or the divisional round games. That's just way too many teams to pick from. I'm going strictly conference championship games, and we're starting off with the 2010 to 2011 NFL season. So starting off with the 2010-2011 NFL season, this one is actually pretty easy for me. I have to pick the New York Jets versus the Chicago Bears as the alternate Super Bowl matchup that could have and even been better than the actual game that happened. Now, that game that did end up happening, if you guys remember, and I actually mentioned this in the last episode too, the game that did end up happening was the Pittsburgh Steelers going up against the Green Bay Packers in a heavyweight matchup between Ben Roethlisberger and Aaron Rodgers. Now, that ended up being a great game, and it came down to the last possession. But the reason why I say New York Jets versus Chicago Bears is just a simple fact of the matter is Mark Sanchez versus Jay Cutler. That would have been awesome. And Rex Ryan had that Jets team buzzing. That team was so much fun to watch. I don't know if you guys remember this far, but the previous week in the divisional round, they went into New England and they beat the Patriots. They beat Tom Brady and the Patriots, and they were flying high. I remember that Bart Scott interview where they were like, "Can't wait. To all the non-believers, way to have our back, Keyshawn." It was such a fun team to watch, such a defensively dominant team. Rex Ryan was a character. He actually promised, he was the perfect coach for the Jets and in that New York market because he was cocky, he was arrogant. He came in and he said, "I guarantee you, I promise you, we are going to the Super Bowl this year." And man, they were one game away. It was so much fun watching that team with Mark Sanchez and the ending stages of LaDainian Tomlinson and Santonio Holmes and Jericho Cotchery and Dustin Keller. And then on the defensive side of the ball, you had Darrelle Revis and Bart Scott, and not to mention, they actually had one of, if not the best offensive line in the game with the late, great Nick Mangold and DeBrickashaw Ferguson, which by far is probably the best and most fun name to say out of all NFL history, DeBrickashaw Ferguson. So shout out DeBrickashaw, but man, that team was so much fun to watch. And on the NFC side of the ball, you had the Chicago Bears led by Jay Cutler and Brandon Marshall and Matt Forte. Man, what a team that was. And they had a stellar defense too. And they had home field advantage, at least throughout that conference championship game. It was played in Chicago. They were playing against the wild card Green Bay Packers. And if you guys remember, Jay Cutler ended up getting hurt halfway through that game, so we truly never know what it could have been at the end because you had the Chicago backups coming in, and one of them actually ended up throwing a pick six to big man B.J. Raji, which was kind of funny to watch. But the final score, I think, ended up being 21-14, and that was with Jay Cutler missing the entire second half. So things could have, should have, and would have been differently, I believe, if Jay Cutler played in that game. And that was just a fun Bears team to watch. There hasn't been a lot of fun Bears football over the years besides this most recent season. So a Chicago-New York battle in the Super Bowl, man, it would have been like having a battle for who has the best pizza, or having a battle for which city is better. So, we were totally robbed in that situation. And now we're moving on to 2011 to 2012. Now, the following season is actually kind of hard to gauge because if we went with the losers of the conference championship games respectively, we would have gotten the Super Bowl matchup that we literally got the next year with Baltimore versus San Francisco and the Harbaugh brothers going up against each other in the Super Bowl. So I can't really say that because we did end up seeing that the following year. So I think I'm going to pick Baltimore versus the New York Giants. The New York Giants ended up winning that Super Bowl that year against the New England Patriots. So I think I'm going to pick the Ravens versus the Giants. Both had mean defenses, and if you remember, Baltimore missed that field goal at the end. I think it was like a 30-yard field goal or a 28-yard field goal or something by Billy Cundiff. He missed it to send it into overtime, which clinched the Super Bowl berth for the New England Patriots. But a Ravens-Giants Super Bowl, that definitely would have fed families. I think it's definitely another East Coast Super Bowl, but man, that would have been awesome. And the Super Bowl was played indoors that year too, so it just would have been perfect weather, defensive teams, super fun to watch. You had Eli Manning going up against Joe Flacco, both guys who show up when it matters the most, even though they're not the greatest of quarterbacks. I can just imagine all of the narratives that could have been wrote about regarding that year if that Super Bowl matchup ended up happening. So that's all I honestly got for that one. Now we're moving on to the 2012-2013 season. Now, the following season, I already mentioned, was Baltimore versus San Francisco in the Harbaugh Bowl. And this one is interesting because no matter how you put it, it would have been a good game either way. So the 4 teams that made the conference championships were the Baltimore Ravens, the New England Patriots, the San Francisco 49ers, and the Atlanta Falcons. Now, I can't just pick both of the losers and say Atlanta versus New England because we did end up getting that Super Bowl in, I believe it was 2017 or maybe, 2017 or 2018, so I want to hold off from picking that. However, I do believe a battle of the 2 seeds between New England and San Francisco, now that's a matchup with 2 legendary franchises that somehow we've just never gotten before. You know, we've seen the 49ers going up against the Chiefs a whole lot of times, and we've seen the 49ers make, I want to say, 7 or 8 different Super Bowls throughout the years, and we've seen New England make like 13 Super Bowls throughout the years, so it almost seems mathematically impossible that we've never seen New England versus San Francisco in the playoffs, but I truly believe that would have been an awesome Super Bowl with Colin Kaepernick back when he was actually Colin Kaepernick, and he was good, and he was dynamic, and he wasn't injured, and Harbaugh and that defense with Navarro Bowman and Patrick Willis and all those guys going up against Tom Brady and New England Patriots and Gronk and I don't know if that was the Welker year or if that was Edelman or Amendola, but, you know, the Patriots, they always have these interchangeable parts, so it's kind of hard to tell the difference between all those short white guys. But I think we were actually robbed from having a 49ers-Patriots Super Bowl all throughout NFL history. I can't believe throughout all the times that we've seen San Francisco in the Super Bowl and the Patriots in the Super Bowl, that they've never actually played against each other. I think that would have been an awesome matchup. Now, moving on, I know I'm just kind of blasting through these, but moving on to the 2013-2014 NFL season. This is a season I don't really like to talk about because although the Broncos were the best offensive in the NFL and probably all throughout NFL history, they ended up getting their teeth kicked in 43-8 by the Seattle Seahawks, and this is Super Bowl 48. I like to think Super Bowl 48 never happened. However, in the Final Four, it was San Francisco, Seattle, New England, and Denver. Now, I just mentioned that San Francisco and New England could have been played in the previous year, and that would have been an awesome matchup, so I can't really pick that one. Now, we also got Seattle versus New England in the following year, so I can't really pick that one either. I think I'm going to have to go with San Francisco versus Denver in the rematch from, I believe it was 1990, maybe 1989 or 1990, where San Francisco ended up beating them 55-10, so I like Denver going into that with sort of historic revenge on their mind, already losing to them 55-10 30 years ago or however long it was. So yeah, and plus I remember that I was actually rooting for San Francisco to win that game against Seattle in the NFC Championship game because I was actually very, very scared of Seattle. That defense was phenomenal. So I think Denver versus San Francisco would have been a little bit more even. San Francisco probably still would have won that year, but you never know. I mean, the San Francisco defense, they were great, but they weren't as great as that Seattle defense. So maybe Denver would have been able to put up a lot more points than at least just 8, I hope. But the reason why I say San Francisco would have probably beat Denver too was because Denver's defense was absolutely atrocious that year. And it wasn't even really a scheme thing or anything like that. They were just riddled with injuries throughout the entire year, and it finally caught up to them in the Super Bowl. And we all know how the following years went when they made some aggressive free agency moves for TJ Ward and DeMarcus Ware and Aqib Talib to fill in those key weaknesses on defense. And I believe that Champ Bailey was one of our starting cornerbacks, and the guy was like 39 years old. Like he ran like a 5-second 40-yard dash. So that just goes to show you how riddled with injuries and how weak the Denver defense was that year, and how we pretty much won 15 games, including the playoffs, that year because of our offense and how many points they ended up scoring and ended up putting up. Now, moving on to the 2014-2015 season, our Final Four was Indianapolis, New England, Green Bay, and Seattle. And like I said before, the Super Bowl ended up being New England versus Seattle, where Russ famously threw the ball at the 1-yard line, and we all know how that went. But I remember specifically rooting for 2 different teams, and it was both the losing teams actually, in these respective conference championship games, with the first one being Indianapolis, who, if you remember, got their absolute teeth kicked in by New England 45-7, and that was actually the game that started the whole Deflategate controversy. And the other game that I was rooting for the opposite team was Green Bay versus Seattle. I was rooting for Green Bay hard, and I honestly thought they had it in the bag. They were up like 22, they were up 19-6 with like 2.5 minutes to go, and then they ended up scoring a touchdown. They scored the 2-point conversion. They converted on the 2-point conversion. They recovered the onside kick. They drove down the field. They tied up the ball game. I was stunned. Forgive me, they actually took the lead 22-19, in which Rodgers got the ball back and drove him back into field goal range, and then they ended up sending it to overtime at 22-22, in which Seattle then got the ball, and we all know how that ended, with Russ dropping an absolute pill 40 yards down the field. I can't remember who was the cornerback that got burned on that route, but that was the game-winning play that sent Seattle into the Super Bowl, and I just remember how absolutely bonkers that entire stadium just got as soon as he caught that pass. And I remember I remember the specific call where it's like, and it is God, Seattle's going to the Super Bowl. Like, it was amazing. It was one of the best games that I've ever seen, but obviously, I was rooting for the other team because I hated Seattle, and I didn't want to see Seattle in the Super Bowl anymore, and the taste of 43-8 was still fresh in my mouth, so I wanted Green Bay to win, and they just absolutely choked. I specifically remember that Russell Wilson threw 4 interceptions in that game. 4 interceptions, and they still won the game. I could not believe it. So this is my obvious answer. Indianapolis versus Green Bay, 2 historic franchises. I think that would have been awesome. Andrew Luck versus Aaron Rodgers. Man, that would have been so much better of an actual matchup than New England versus Seattle. Obviously, it was 1 seed versus 1 seed, and that ended up being one of the greatest Super Bowls of all time, with Malcolm Butler making one of the greatest plays in NFL history, intercepting Russell Wilson at the 1-yard line. Man, what could have been with that Andrew Luck versus Aaron Rodgers Super Bowl? I still think about it to this day. Anyways, moving on to 2015 versus 2016. This one's going to be a little tough because obviously the Broncos made it to the Super Bowl, so it kind of pains me to pick another team other than Denver, although I guess I could keep Denver in it and just pick, because the Final Four was Arizona, Carolina, New England, and Denver, so I guess I could pick Denver versus Arizona, but man, Denver was such a better team than Arizona that year, so I don't really think the game would have been all that much better. Arizona had Carson Palmer and Larry Fitzgerald, and they just would have stood no chance against that Denver defense. Carson Palmer would have been sent into retirement. Like, it was that would have been elder abuse. Now, an interesting matchup would have been New England versus Arizona, though. I think, or New England versus Carolina, actually, because you get that Superman MVP Cam Newton coming in. He's flexing. He's dabbing all over the place. That whole entire Panthers team is feeling themselves. They went 15-1. And then you get Tom Brady, big bad Tom Brady, rolling into town with his, I think at this point he had 4 rings or 5 rings. And he's coming in. And, obviously that Patriots defense wasn't as dominant as the Denver defense. So I think Cam Newton would have been able to score and push the ball down the field more often, and they wouldn't have been able to force as many turnovers as the Denver Broncos defense did. So honestly, I think that's going to be my pick. I think Patriots versus Panthers, double P, the rematch of the 2003, or maybe it was 2004 Super Bowl. I think that would have been a good sight to see. And we all know how Brady does in these Super Bowl rematches. I remember when it was the Eagles versus the Patriots in what I believe was either the following year or the year after, the Eagles ended up exacting revenge on the Patriots. So maybe Carolina would have gotten their first and only Super Bowl if New England was able to overcome Denver. But that was all she wrote, and now we are moving on to the 2016-2017 season. Wow, we are just blasting through these. The Final Four for the 2016 to 2017 NFL season was the Pittsburgh Steelers going up against the New England Patriots, and then Green Bay Packers going up against the Atlanta Falcons. Now, one thing that I just noticed from overlooking this bracket at least, is that this conference championship weekend was not close at all. The Patriots beat the Steelers 36-17, and Atlanta beat Green Bay 44-21. So both of them were multiple possession victories. It just was not a good weekend for football that week. Now, obviously, we all remember what happened when Atlanta blew a 28-3 lead against New England in one of the craziest, if not the craziest, comeback of all time, leading to Tom Brady's 5th ring, I believe. And this one is actually kind of tough because you can't pick Green Bay versus Pittsburgh because we've already seen that matchup just a few years back. I think actually this would have been a good year to see Brady versus Rodgers. I think Green Bay versus New England, I think the result would have remained the same. I think Tom Brady would have probably still gotten his 5th ring, and he probably wouldn't have done it so dramatically. I don't think he would have been coming back 28-3 against the Green Bay Packers, although you never know, it is the Packers. So yeah, that would have been interesting. I think there is actually multiple opportunities that we could have seen Rodgers, or no, this is actually the first. There would have been multiple opportunities for us to see Rodgers versus Brady in the Super Bowl, and I think this is the year that I'm actually going to pick it and lock it in. I think that would have. We were absolutely robbed as football fans, just non-biased football fans, over Patriots Packers, another double P. That would have been, oh man, that would have been an awesome game. I'm just getting goosebumps just thinking about it, man. And obviously the other Super Bowl matchup I could pick is Pittsburgh versus Atlanta, and that just does not excite me. That doesn't tickle a single bone in my body. Yeah, I think I'm going to have to go with New England versus Green Bay in this one. Now, moving on to the 2017-2018 season, this was already a great Super Bowl the way it was. However, the way New England got to that Super Bowl, and I might remind you guys, this was the Super Bowl with Nick Foles and the Philadelphia Eagles besting the New England Patriots. Gosh, I feel like I'm seeing New England so many different times throughout. They just owned this decade. This was crazy. Anyways, the reason that the Patriots ended up making the Super Bowl this year was because the refs missed a controversial call against the Patriots when Miles Jack was ruled down even though he had never been touched when recovering the football and ultimately returning it for a touchdown, which would have put Jacksonville in position with less than 10 minutes to go in the ballgame to advance to their first ever Super Bowl. And they got absolutely robbed by the refs, and people still talk about it to this day because of how egregious that call was by the referees. On the other side, it was Minnesota versus Philadelphia, and that just wasn't close at all. Philadelphia ended up beating Minnesota 38-7 with a backup quarterback, and I remember Minnesota was going into that game with all the momentum in the world because that was the game where Case Keenum hit Diggs down the sideline sideline, and he stayed inbounds and ran it all the way into the end zone for a touchdown as time expired for a game-winning touchdown against the New Orleans back in the divisional round of the playoffs. So with all that steam, they went into Philadelphia thinking that they could beat a backup quarterback in Nick Foles, and boy, were they wrong, because they were beat 38-7, like I said. So do I dare say that Jacksonville versus Minnesota would have been a better Super Bowl, or even a great Super Bowl to watch? I don't know. I mean, it would have been cool to see, because they would have been, whoever won that game would have been the first time that they have ever won a Super Bowl in their entire franchise history. So I think that would have been cool. However, I don't know. Case Keenum just doesn't really do it for me. And neither does really Blake Bortles. But that Jaguars team, their strength was the defense. And it was so fun to watch, man. That was when they had Malik Jackson and Jalen Ramsey. And they had all these dogs on that defense, man. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep Philly in there. They definitely deserve to make it, and make it the Super Bowl that we should have gotten, which was Philly versus Jacksonville. And I think that still would have been a good game, because that defense could have locked down Nick Foles, and Doug Peterson, I think, would have had a tougher time calling some plays for that Philadelphia Eagles team. So I don't know, that could have been a great game, and that was actually Philadelphia's first ever Super Bowl, so it would have been an opportunity for both teams to get their first ever Super Bowl ring. So yeah, I think that's going to be my pick. I'm going to lock it in. Let's go Jacksonville versus Philadelphia for the 2017-2018 season. Now, moving on to the 2018-2019 season. This season was an absolute bore to me, I believe. This was when the Rams went up against the Patriots in the Super Bowl, and that was when the Patriots ended up beating the Rams 13-3, and Brady ended up getting his sixth and final ring with the New England Patriots, at least, and what ultimately led up to one of the most boring Super Bowls that I think I have ever watched in my entire life, besides obviously 43-8. So let's go through the Final Four. The Final Four was New England winning against Kansas City in overtime in Kansas City, and then the Rams besting New Orleans in New Orleans to go to the Super Bowl. Now, obviously, what jumps out to me right off the bat, speaking of egregious calls, was that missed pass interference penalty against the Rams inside the red zone, which would have been all but clinched the trip for the Saints to go to the Super Bowl that year, and we were robbed. Again, we were robbed from a Breeze Brady Super Bowl. We had already seen I believe it was 2009, 2010, we have already seen a Breeze Manning Super Bowl, but we had never, ever seen a Breeze Brady Super Bowl, and man, that would have been awesome. So, obviously, right off the bat, I can go ahead and pick New Orleans versus New England. I think that would have been a much, much better Super Bowl. Sean Payton, he's a demon in the playoffs. He's always scheming up something, whether it's an onside kick or a fake punt or something, So I think that would have been awesome to see, Breeze versus Brady. Now, on the other hand, I could also pick Kansas City versus the Rams, because I believe that was the season where Kansas City played against the Rams on Monday Night Football, and the final score ended up being like 55-51 or something like that. So that was one of the greatest regular season football games of all time. So that would have been another great pick for the Super Bowl, Chiefs versus Rams. Now, obviously, I'm a Chiefs hater, and I'm also a Patriots hater, so it's kind of a lose-lose no matter which way I pick. So I think both of those picks would have been awesome Super Bowls, and actually a lot better than the actual Super Bowl that we got that year. Now, moving on to the 2019-2020 season, this Final Four is such a weird Final Four, and it starts off kind of normal. You got Green Bay and San Francisco, and San Francisco ended up winning that one handily, 37-20, and then you had Tennessee against Kansas City, and Kansas City ended up beating Tennessee 35-24. So it's just weird seeing Tennessee in there, and honestly, I'm gonna go ahead and pick them, because personally, I've only seen Tennessee in the Super Bowl once in my life, and that was back in 2000. So I have literally no conscious memory of that whatsoever. So Tennessee versus Green Bay, that would have actually been pretty cool. I think that would have been a cool uniform matchup too. I'm not even gonna go into like the players or Rodgers or Tannehill or anything like that, but just that light blue, that baby blue with the dark pants that the Titans got, and then the Green Bay with that dark green or those white and yellow, like that just would have been an aesthetically pleasing Super Bowl over the actual Super Bowl that we got, which was San Francisco versus Kansas City, where it was just red on yellow on red on yellow on red on yellow. It was kind of gross. So yeah, I'm even though Tennessee was not that fun of a watch that year, I definitely got to go Tennessee versus Green Bay. This is an easy one for me. Now, moving on to the 2020 to 2021 NFL season. This was the COVID Super Bowl, which was, God, it was such a weird season that year, but this was finally the year that we got Brady versus Rodgers in the playoffs, but not in the Super Bowl, because if you remember, Brady went to Tampa Bay, and he led Tampa Bay as a 5 seed to the Super Bowl and ended up beating Kansas City 31-9 in one of the most lopsided Super Bowls in recent memory. So I say the word recent is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. Anyway, so Green Bay was the number 1 seed going up against Tampa Bay, and then you had Kansas City as the number 1 seed going up against Buffalo. And this one is actually pretty easy to me. I think if both of the road teams won that weekend, that would have been awesome, with Buffalo versus Tampa Bay. That would have been Josh Allen versus Tom Brady in the Super Bowl. Now, it was kind of a young, raw Josh Allen. He was still, coming into his own. He wasn't one of the best quarterbacks, but he was definitely becoming one of the best quarterbacks at that point in time. So Buffalo versus Tampa Bay, I think definitely would have been a fun Super Bowl to watch. Green Bay versus Kansas City, Rodgers versus Mahomes, I think that would have been an awesome Super Bowl to watch too. Now, obviously, like I said, this was the COVID year, so there would have been no fans either way. So it was kind of a weird way either side that you look at it, but obviously, I don't think you can go wrong with either answer. Kansas City versus Green Bay, Buffalo versus Tampa Bay, Buffalo versus Green Bay. I think any of these choices would have been awesome. And obviously we ended up getting the worst case scenario, which was Tampa Bay versus Kansas City. But we did end up getting Brady versus Mahomes in the Super Bowl. And Brady showed why he is leagues better than Mahomes, at least historically speaking, by beating them 31-9. And Mahomes I remember he was just running for his life that entire game. He was making some awesome throws, but they were not being caught. So yeah, anyway, moving on to the 2021-2022 season, where there was actual fans in attendance this time around. Back to normal real life, back to reality. We had in our Final Four, San Francisco going up against the Rams, in which the Rams ended up besting them 20-17, and Cincinnati and the Kansas City Chiefs, in which, if you remember, this was Kansas City's sole Super Bowl appearance in the Joe Burrow era, and they ended up beating them in overtime 27-24. Now, this was actually the rare occasion where we get the best case scenario Super Bowl out of the Final Four that we were presented with the Rams and the Bengals. So I think that was there's not really a better matchup that I can really see on here. I mean, San Francisco versus Kansas City, we had already gotten that, and we're going to get that again here soon. And the Bengals versus the 49ers, actually, yeah, that would have been pretty cool too. Bengals versus 49ers, because then the Bengals could have exacted revenge for losing in the Super Bowl back in the 80s against Joe Montana. So that would have actually been a pretty cool storyline. So I think that's actually where I'm going to go with this. I could pick the Rams versus Kansas City, but obviously you don't want to see Kansas City in the Super Bowl again after seeing them for like 6 straight years, So I think my pick for this one is going to have to be 49ers versus the Bengals. Now, I don't think that's going to be a better game than the actual matchup that we got with the Rams and the Bengals. So, yeah, I don't know. This is kind of a weird year where we actually got a great matchup, and it wasn't teams that you saw every single year. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I think this was a great year for football, and it ended up great, even in the playoffs and even in the Super Bowl. This was actually the first year that I ended up hosting my Super Bowl party, and it was just an awesome year, and it was an awesome time having all my friends over and watching a great game. And yeah, I've kind of talked about this one too much. Let's move on to 2022 to 2023. Now, in the following season, our Final Four consisted of Cincinnati, Kansas City, San Francisco, and Philadelphia. So 3 of the 4 teams that made it the previous year made it again in the next year. So the only newcomer was Philadelphia with Jalen Hurts on the scene, and they were pounding teams left and right. They were very, very dominant in this playoff run because they ended up as the number 1 seed, and in the divisional round they beat up on the Giants 38-7, and then that was the following game, I should say, against San Francisco, where Brock Purdy broke his elbow, and they ended up beating and dominating that game against Brock Purdy 31-7. And then on the other side, you had Kansas City exacting their revenge on Cincinnati and making it back to the Super Bowl for probably the 3rd time in the last 4 years, or however many times it was. And we ended up getting a great Super Bowl with Kansas City and Philadelphia. It didn't end great because obviously you never want a Super Bowl to end in a ref call, even though it was the correct call. You don't want to make that mistake in the Super Bowl. I know James Bradbury is still thinking about that moment to this day, but this is another one where you could pick 49ers versus the Bengals. You could pick Kansas City versus San Francisco. No. Honestly, Philadelphia versus Cincinnati, I think that would have been a pretty fun one to watch, and I think Jalen Hurts would have won his first Super Bowl at the time against the Bengals that year. So I don't know, the Bengals making it back-to-back Super Bowls, that would have been pretty cool. I think that's going to be my pick, is Philadelphia versus Cincinnati. Now moving on to the 2023-2024 NFL season, this one was pretty interesting because this one had Detroit, San Francisco, Kansas City, and Baltimore. And honestly, I wanted a Detroit-Baltimore Super Bowl so bad, and it almost happened because Detroit was up, I believe, 24-7 going into the half against San Francisco in San Francisco because they were the number 1 seed. On the other side, Baltimore was also the number 1 seed, and they were heavily favored. This was supposed to be Lamar's year. He won MVP this year, and obviously a lot of things happened. I think Justin Tucker missed a field goal, and then Zay Flowers, I almost said Brandon Flowers. Zay Flowers fumbled at the 1-yard line. There was too many devastating mistakes that the Ravens made. So this one of the easiest picks I've had to make all podcast long today. Ravens versus Lions would have been so freaking sweet, man. I'm still not over this one. So yeah, that one's going to be my obvious pick. Plus, we had already seen Baltimore versus San Francisco earlier in the year, and Baltimore actually spanked them up pretty bad. And that was in San Francisco as well. I think that was the game that actually clinched Lamar winning MVP that year. Baltimore just had a very, very dominant team that year. So I would have loved to see them in the Super Bowl going up against Detroit, a team that has pretty much suffered throughout their entire history. So it would have just been so sweet to watch. They had finally won their division and God knows how long, and yeah, we were absolutely robbed with this one. Just Kansas City versus San Francisco again. Like, nobody wants to see this, man. Now, moving on to the 2024-2025 NFL season, our Final Four consisted of Buffalo, Kansas City, Washington, and Philadelphia. Wow, it's almost like this was just last year. Anyways, Buffalo beating Kansas City obviously would have been a lot better of a Super Bowl. In my opinion, I don't think Philadelphia would have beaten them 40-22 or 40-6 and then, 16 garbage time points at the end. But obviously Buffalo making it in the AFC instead of Kansas City for like the 18th time in a row. And then obviously Washington, it was a miracle they even got that far, and they got absolutely smoked by the Philadelphia Eagles 55-23. I don't know if I can even really pick the Commanders to make it because it didn't really seem like they even deserved to make it that far. They kind of overachieved that year, and we kind of saw that this year. So but screw it. That would have been actually a lot of fun to watch. Commanders versus Buffalo. Commanders versus Bills would have been a great Super Bowl to watch, no matter how you look at it. Buffalo had its weaknesses. The Commanders had a lot of weaknesses, but they had a generational rookie. That would have been an awesome Super Bowl to watch. I think that's the easy pick there, is Commanders versus Bills. Now, moving on to the 2025-2026 season, aka this season. This one, I'm going to appear a little biased, as I always do. The Final Four was LA Rams, Seattle Seahawks, New England Patriots, and yours truly's Denver Broncos. Now, I want to make a little caveat by saying If Bo Nix was healthy, Denver is the easy pick here over New England. But since Bo Nix is not healthy, I don't think anybody on earth, any non-Bronco fan, wants to see Jared Stidham and the Denver Broncos in the Super Bowl. So I'm going to have to stick with New England if Bo Nix is still injured. But if we're living in this little fantasy world, and since it's my fantasy, I can do whatever I want, Bo Nix remains healthy, I'm picking Denver in this one. And then in terms of Seattle or the Rams, there's two ways I can go about this. As a Broncos fan, we have not beaten the Rams since 2003. It's the longest drought out of any other opponent that the Denver Broncos have had. They have beaten every single team in recent memory for me to think about, except for the Rams. I did not have any conscious memory when the Broncos beat the Rams. So obviously, Broncos versus Rams is my pick here. Although, if we did both 1 seeds, Broncos versus Seattle, it would have been nice to exact revenge against Seattle. However, Seattle is a very, very, very dominant team, and I have them winning the Super Bowl against the fully healthy Patriots by multiple scores next Sunday. So, for me to pick Denver and Seattle, I think we would have been absolutely smoked by Seattle. And nobody wants to watch that happen yet again. So I think the obvious answer has to be Rams versus Broncos. You know, we haven't beaten them since 2003. Matt Stafford gets one more shot at another Super Bowl. It's kind of new school versus old school with Sean Payton going up against Sean McVay. It's the battle of the Seans. I think that would have been an awesome Super Bowl. And, you know, you got a great Broncos defense with Pat Surtain and Nick Bonito and all those dogs on one side going up against a stacked offense with Matt Stafford and Kyren Williams and Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams. And I think that just would have been an awesome game. And, of course, we were robbed by the snow. We were robbed by the broken ankle bone of Bo Nix, you know, unfortunately. So, yeah, I don't know. This one is kind of interesting to me. Obviously, like I said, if Bo Nix is healthy, then Denver versus Rams. But if he's not healthy, I guess we'll go ahead and pick that one too. We'll go Patriots versus Rams in a Super Bowl. Was the 2018 Super Bowl or the 2019 Super Bowl rematch? But with this time, it would have been the battle of MVPs. May versus Stafford. We'll see who truly deserves the MVP, and whoever wins that MVP like the Thursday before the Super Bowl, then obviously the other one has a huger chip on the shoulder, you know, like he's going to show you why he deserves the MVP, and both star-studded offenses going up against each other. That would have been cool too. So, and obviously I'm only picking that one if the rules remain the same and Bo Nix remains injured. But if Bo Nix does not remain injured and he's fully healthy, then my pick yet again will be Broncos versus Rams. Anyways, that wraps up our special edition episode, this episode 9 of Bring the Sink. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you guys so much for your support. Tune in next week where I'll probably have another special edition episode for the beginning of the week, whether it's Monday or Tuesday, and we will have to figure out what topic we're going to talk about that Monday or Tuesday night. But stay tuned. There is more coming. I am going to keep pushing these out, God willing, and it's awesome and it's a lot of fun. And thank you guys so much if you have made it this far, and stay tuned for more. Peace!